Will federal employees get a pay raise in 2026? Here's what we know, and here's what is missing. So you may be thinking, it's only August. Why are we talking about a pay raise for next year already? It's way too early. I'm not even thinking about 2026 yet. Well, August is actually a significant month for the pay raise process, and I'm going to explain why in this video. The expectation right now is that there will not be a pay raise for federal employees in 2026. The reason I say that is because the White House budget proposal that came out a few months ago was silent on the matter of a pay raise for federal employees. However, it proposed a raise for members of the military. So because of that, the presumption is that there is not going to be a pay raise proposed by President Trump for 2026. I mentioned August is a significant month as part of the pay raise process. And the reason is because of the alternative pay plan letter. That has to be issued in the month of August. So what does this letter do? It's part of FEPCA, the Federal Employees Pay Comparability Act process. I'll get to that in a moment. But the alternative pay plan letter typically includes details about the president's proposal for a pay raise for the coming year. So that would include things like locality pay adjustments and what the actual base pay raise will be. It normally will break all of that down. Or if the presumption of a pay freeze comes to fruition, it would spell out no pay raise, that the president is proposing a freeze for the coming year. Last year, as an example, President Biden, in his alternative pay plan letter, proposed a 1.7% base pay raise for federal employees for 2025, with 0.3% for locality pay, so a 2% overall average raise total. The alternative pay plan letter is part of FEPCA. That is the Federal Employees Pay Comparability Act. It was passed into law in 1990, and it establishes an automatic formula for federal employee pay raises. But the president can override this formula, and usually does, by issuing the alternative pay plan letter. And that's why this letter is significant. It has to be issued in August. That's the deadline for it. It typically comes out late in August. And the historical precedent in terms of pay freezes is that a letter is still typically issued even if there's no pay raise being proposed. During President Obama's term, there were 3 years of no raises for federal employees, and the letter was issued in 2 of those 3 years. 2012 was an exception because the pay freeze was formalized through legislation that was passed by Congress, which overrode any automatic adjustments under FEPCA and took away the need for issuing the letter that year. But in the other 2 years, there was a letter issued. As also, President Trump proposed a pay freeze in his first term. In his alternative pay plan letter in August 2018, he spelled out a pay freeze for 2019. And that was an interesting year too, because Congress got involved, and in February of 2019, they passed legislation that included a 1.9% raise for federal employees, and it was done retroactively back to the start of the year. So that was very unusual. It's also pretty unusual for Congress to get involved in the process at all, but that's an example showing that they can and sometimes do. This year, Congress has proposed a 4.3% raise for federal employees, or I should say, two lawmakers in Congress did. They introduced the Federal Adjustment of Income Rates, or FAIR Act, and that was issued by Congressman Jerry Connolly shortly before he passed away, and Senator Brian Schatz. And the two of them have issued this legislation every year going back a number of years. It's not going to happen, but it is just an example of how Congress can insert itself into this process. If that bill were to make it through Congress and become law, that would be the pay raise for federal employees. Pay parity is something you may hear about in 2026 because of this discrepancy between the military and the federal workforce in terms of what's being proposed for the pay raise. As I mentioned, the White House budget didn't mention a raise for federal employees, but it is proposing a 3.8% raise for members of the military. And so oftentimes pay parity will be an argument for giving one group or the other a higher raise. In this case, proponents for the federal workforce are saying, hey, we need pay parity to have a raise that's equal with members of the military. And that would be a much higher raise, obviously, 3.8% versus no raise. So that's the concept of pay parity. It's just making the two groups equal. This table that I'm putting up on the screen shows how the average military and civilian pay raises have come out since 2003. And generally speaking, military pay raises have come out higher. Since 2007, the military pay raises have often outpaced federal employee raises. And there have even been some years where federal employees did not get a raise. I mentioned the 3 years during the Obama administration. And there are years when there's a pretty decent discrepancy. 2025, this year, is a good example of that. The military raise was more than double what federal employees got. On the other hand, there are quite a few years where both groups got the same number of raises, but this is some historical data on how pay parity fares. So what happens next? As I said, the alternative pay plan letter is expected to be issued in August. That's usually later in the month. And it will spell out whatever the president wants the pay raise to be for the coming year. As I said, I expect it's going to propose a pay freeze or no pay raise, but we could be surprised. And regardless of what it proposes, Congress could still get involved and override whatever the president is proposing. I think that's very unlikely to happen, but it can happen. Assuming Congress does not get involved, as I expect, then the next step would be in December, the president will issue an executive order formalizing the pay raise and finalizing it. And then shortly after that, the Office of Personnel Management will issue new pay tables for the coming year that include the raise or lack thereof. Regardless of whatever the outcome of next year's pay raise may be, we'll be providing more updates as soon as they become available. So please subscribe to the channel and also visit the fedsmith.com website, where we'll be posting articles with more information on this and other topics. Have a good day.